Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Joshua Gonzalez, and I'm the Assistant Cultural Affairs Officer here at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo. In collaboration with our partner, World Learning, we're excited to bring to you today a very great virtual program. The topic for today's program is the U.S. Japan Climate Partnership, Technology and Innovation. Today, I'm joined by our speaker, Ms. Sonia Aggarwal, Chief Executive Officer at the Energy Innovation Policy and Technology. I'm also pleased to be joined today by our moderator, Dr. Takanobu Aikawa, Senior Researcher at the Renewable Energy Institute. Before we begin, I have a few administrative items that I'd like to go over. First, the speaker and the moderator are not employees of the U.S. government, so their remarks do not represent the official policy of the U.S. government. For today's program, we are providing simultaneous English and Japanese interpretation. To use the interpretation feature, please click on the globe below and select the language that you would like to listen to today's program in. Instructions are also on your screen now. Captioning for today's program is available in your web browser. Instructions can be found in the chat box, so please take a look there. Following today's discussion, we will open up the session for questions and answers. I invite you throughout the program, when our speakers are having conversation or during the Q&A portion itself, to please submit your questions in the Q&A box. You can submit your questions anonymously. You may also submit your questions in either Japanese or in English, so don't be shy. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker and our moderator for today's program. Ms. Sonia Aggarwal is the Chief Executive Officer of Energy Innovation, where she leads the organization and works closely with partners and policymakers on effective climate and clean energy policies across North America, Asia, and Europe. Sonia was a founding director of Energy Innovation, building energy innovations policy research, modeling, and analysis teams over 8 years until she was appointed to serve in the Biden administration as Special Assistant to the President for Climate Policy, Innovation, and Deployment. While at the White House, Sonia helped to set the United States target to cut greenhouse gas emissions at least in half by 2030. Sonia has deep experience in energy modeling, analysis, and policy design in many of the world's largest emitting countries and regions. She spearheaded the creation of America's Power Plan, a platform to identify innovative thinking on decarbonization policy solutions for affordable, reliable electric power. For Energy Innovation, Sonia managed global research at ClimateWorks Foundation, worked on the McKinsey carbon abatement cost curves, advised the International Energy Agency's Accelerating Technology Transitions Project, advised clean energy companies on technology and financial communications, and worked in accident prevention design engineering at a nuclear power plant. In 2019, she received the U.S. Department of Energy's Clean Energy Education and Empowerment Award. Sonia holds a BS from Haverford College in Astronomy and Physics and an MS from Stanford University in Engineering focused on energy. Today's moderator is Dr. Takanobu Aikawa. Dr. Aikawa is Senior Researcher at Renewable Energy Institute, where he specializes in bioenergy policies, focuses his research on sustainable bioenergy, and is engaged in mid and long-term decarbonization scenario development. Since April 2019, he has been a member of the Bioenergy Sustainability Working Group at the Agency for Natural Resources and Energy under the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry, also known as METI. In addition, he serves as an expert for several government committees related to bioenergy, including the Technical Committee on Biofuel Development at METI. Previously, he was at Mitsubishi UFJ Research and Consulting and conducted research and consulting on the forestry industry. He holds his master's degree in forest ecology from the Graduate School of Agriculture, Kyoto University, and received a doctorate in agricultural studies on human resources development, policy, and forest management at the Research Faculty of Agriculture at Hokkaido University. So with that, I would like to turn it over to our distinguished speaker, Sonia, please.
Arigatou gozaimasu to you, Joshua, and it is wonderful to be here with you, Aikawa-san. I am so happy to have the opportunity to talk with you all about some of the developments on climate and clean energy security policy here in the U.S., to congratulate you on the Green Transformation Law and look for more ways that our two nations can work together. So I want to start by just acknowledging what an exciting moment we are in for clean energy right now. The world is truly turning a corner on clean energy. Bloomberg just released an analysis showing a 30% cost drop for solar panels since this time last year. Solar and batteries now cost a tenth of what they cost a decade ago. Wind costs just about half as much. And on top of all of that technology progress that we are seeing, we are in a very exciting moment in the United States for climate and clean energy and energy security policy. Over the last couple of years, the United States has adopted a series of very important laws. The American Manufacturing and Innovation Act is helping us to reduce hydrofluorocarbons, aligned with the Kigali Agreement, which helps us get rid of those very planet-warming gases. The Energy Act of 2020 provides a bunch of additional technology innovation funding for some of the most important technologies that we see the largest potential for here in the US, things like long duration energy storage for the grid. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act was passed under the Biden administration. That is a bipartisan law, which means both of the parties in our country have agreed that there are really important investments in our infrastructure that we are very far behind in making. And the bipartisan infrastructure law, this law, makes enormous investments in our transmission system, in hubs for clean hydrogen, in all kinds of important technology areas and infrastructure. And then the Inflation Reduction Act is a really landmark piece of legislation that passed last year, right around this time. And that is the law that will fundamentally change the greenhouse gas emissions trajectory of the United States. So that means that I will probably focus some of the rest of what I say on updating you all on what the Inflation Reduction Act is and some of the benefits that we expect to see from the law. Then I'm going to look forward to a conversation with Aikawa-san about what the Green Transformation Law and the Inflation Reduction Act mean for additional areas of cooperation between our two nations. So first, what is the Inflation Reduction Act? It is the most significant climate and clean energy legislation in US history. Because of the weirdness of our legislative system here in the United States, the only things we could do under the Inflation Reduction Act were to increase or decrease the government budget. That means that the law has to do a lot of incentivizing of clean energy manufacturing and clean energy deployment, of cleaner industrial processes, climate smart agriculture, better forest management. So it's a lot of incentives in this law. It covers everything from the electricity system to the vehicles and transportation systems, buildings, heavy industrial sectors, and also land use. In the electricity sector in particular, we adopted tax credits that support wind, that support solar, energy storage, nuclear, and carbon capture and sequestration. We included provisions to help rural electricity providers and financing provisions that can help convert old energy infrastructure into modern, cheaper, and cleaner energy infrastructure. And in general, we expect this is going to stimulate a huge increase, especially in solar, wind, and energy storage built around the US. We think that there is a chance that some nuclear and carbon capture could be built in the electricity system, but every independent analysis of the impacts of this law suggests that the economics favor wind and solar and battery storage. So we expect to see quite a lot of additional development of that kind of power. And that's on trend with the rest of the world also. According to the International Energy Agency, utility-scale solar PV and offshore wind are the cheapest options for new electricity generation in most countries over the entire world. Global solar capacity is on track to triple between now and 2027. Which would mean it surpasses coal to become the largest source of power capacity in the world. So this is primarily a story about solar, onshore and offshore wind and grid storage that just will probably beat many of the other options on economics and cost alone. Beyond the electricity sector, there are also tax credits for zero emissions vehicles. And we expect that that will quicken how many people are adopting electric vehicles here in America. In California, already 1 of every 4 cars being sold today is electric. And so even though the Inflation Reduction Act includes incentives for clean hydrogen production that are very substantial, we don't see a strong future for hydrogen-powered vehicles here in the United States, due mostly to the associated infrastructure challenges. We are seeing adoption of electric vehicles now, and the increase is incredibly impressive. The law also includes a slew of other programs, a methane emissions reduction program that places a fee on methane leaks from the oil and gas system. In heavy industry, there are billions of dollars of investment in the first of a kind zero carbon industrial facilities in sectors like steel, cement, fertilizer, chemicals. And then across all of these programs in the law, there are provisions that are intended to support high quality jobs, domestic manufacturing, and that will provide economic opportunities for the communities in America that have historically borne the biggest burden from pollution. And it is also, I think, worth noting that due in part to the fact that we had to design this law using a lot of incentives, we really have seen an incredible response from companies. And that's just one reason that we believe this law will persist well beyond this presidential administration and this Congress. And in fact, we really believe that it is likely that U.S. policymakers will build on this law, that people will double down when they see the economic benefits that it is stimulating. So to talk about the benefits just for a minute, and then we will get to a conversation. So in the short months since the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, we've already seen 100 clean energy manufacturing projects announced. New manufacturing projects that did not exist before the passage of this law less than a year ago. Those projects alone are worth $73 billion of investment and expected to create more than 60,000 jobs. We are also adding power generation and other infrastructure projects at an increased pace. There have been more than 200 new clean energy projects announced since the passage of the law, and that is supporting more than 140,000 jobs and $240 billion in investments. The law is putting the United States on track to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by about 40% below 2005 levels in 2030. And that's reducing greenhouse gases by about 1 billion tons in that year alone compared to before this law was passed. It also has funding for innovation that's supporting new technologies, but primarily focused on large-scale, rapid deployment of commercially available technologies to decarbonize each of these important sectors that I talked about. And that's why the focus on deploying commercially available technologies that are proven, that can cut energy costs for people, that is why this law is expected to triple our rate of decarbonization for the rest of this decisive decade on climate here in the United States. There's also many public health benefits we expect to see, that it would avoid more than 4,000 early deaths and 120,000 asthma attacks that would have happened in 2030 without this legislation. It's also going to create more than 1 million jobs that year, increase U.S. GDP by $200 billion per year in today's dollars. And even as it's stimulating all of these other economic benefits, we expect that it will lower household energy bills by about $80 every year. And even though it sounds like all of this is almost too good to be true, I think it really is the case that we are in such a special moment for clean energy and climate action that this is just the beginning of the benefits that we will see from this transformation. And we see huge economic opportunity, huge opportunity to provide new options for communities that have historically not been part of these new energy efforts, to be part of the change that we all see. And we expect that we can lower energy bills here and increase our energy security in the United States by all of this action. So happy to take questions and have a conversation about what all we can do together.
ソニアさん、ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much, Sonia. I'm going to serve as moderator today. My name is Aikawa from Renewable Energy Institute. Sonia has been playing a very important role in climate and energy policy for the Biden administration. So I'm really looking forward to asking questions on behalf of the Japanese audience. You have already explained about IRA, and we would like to ask some additional questions, but we would also would like to look at the technological changes that are taking place right now. So my first question would be on IRA. You've talked about solar and wind, and you talked about tax incentives. But on the other hand, as you said, solar and wind costs are becoming much cheaper already. So in the United States, solar and wind are the most economically reasonable options, and IRA is providing additional tax incentives. Is that correct as the situational awareness and understanding?
Yes, in fact, my organization, Energy Innovation, has been doing an analysis since 2019, looking at the comparison between the going forward operating costs of our existing coal power plants compared with the costs, the all-in costs of building new wind and solar plus battery storage. And the latest version of this analysis, which was updated last year, finds that for all but one coal power plant in the United States, more than 99% of our coal capacity, we could replace that electricity with a new wind and solar plus storage project within the same local area, within 50 miles of the existing coal plant, for a cost that is cheaper than just continuing to operate the existing coal fleet. So yes, the answer is we have very low cost options to provide reliable electricity that is without all of the pollution drawbacks of the legacy energy system. So you might ask, why did we give more incentives to these things? The short answer is that it's not that we don't expect this transformation to happen due to costs alone. It just will not happen at the pace that we need it to happen in order to meet the climate crisis, to also make sure that we are getting families the energy cost savings that they can and should get from the transition to clean electricity, because many of our utilities will just continue to run those coal plants if there's not additional push to move toward cleaner energy sources.
ありがとうございます。大変、よくわかりました。政策という観
So from a policy standpoint, so we are facing climate crisis, and so we need to accelerate the renewables, and we share that perspective in Japan as well. So I understand that these incentives are needed. A related question. So by continuing this kind of policy, by 2030 and 2035, we're talking about relatively short term or mid-term. What's going to happen to the electricity sector? What will be the percentage of the renewables, and what kind of growth you are expecting? Please, Sonia.
Yes, so before this administration, the Biden presidency began, we were at about 40% clean electricity. So that includes all of the non-carbon emitting power sources, everything but coal and gas. We expect that we could be on track for about 80% clean electricity in 2030. 2030 is 343 weeks away. And that scale of transformation is enormous and very fast for this sector. But pretty much all of the independent analysis, as well as the official government analysis of the impacts of recent policies, suggest that this is very much within reach for 2030. You may also be aware that President Biden set a target for 100% clean electricity system by no later than 2035. So that gives us 5 years after 2030 to make it the rest of the way.
ありがとうございます。日本の
Thank you. it's a very stimulating number and target for Japanese listeners. So we understand that this is the kind of pace you are making progress. So what's being discussed in Japan oftentimes is that when we talk about solar and wind, they are obviously influenced by climate and weather. And how do you balance the demand and supply? It's a big challenge. So there are various ways of thinking to this. So one is adjusting with the help of coal-fired power. So some people say that we still need fossil fuel power. So what do you think to stabilize the power grid, and what's being discussed in the United States?
Yes, this is a very important question. Nothing is a bigger problem than the power going out and people being cold and not having any lights. That's very important. So very much in all of the analysis that we are doing here in the United States, reliability and resilience of our grid is central. And we are not making any policy. There is no room at all to make any policy that will threaten reliability. In fact, if anything, our policies are doubling down or further concentrating on delivering reliable electricity to all of the families and businesses across this country. So, for example, one thing that is a very exciting recent development from the United States is our largest competitive power market, which is in the middle of our country. It's called PJM. It's a competitive electricity market that provides power to places like Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Maryland, Ohio, the middle of the country. They have now said that how much we can depend on offshore wind to provide reliable electricity at all of the most important times is actually greater than how much we can depend on natural gas power plants. This is a recent analysis that just came out, but this is because even for fossil fuels, in tough weather events, it can sometimes be very hard to deliver that fuel to the power plants that need it at the times they need that power. So it's not as if coal and natural gas are these quintessentially reliable sources of electricity, and variable renewables are somehow less reliable. We understand very much when the sun comes up every day. We know when the sun will go down. We understand weather patterns well enough to be able to integrate variable renewable energy sources quite well into the grid. And if anything, here in the United States at least, our coal power plant fleet is very old, and it is not designed to operate flexibly. So the coal cannot just ramp up and down in order to figure out how to meet demand in whatever hour. We have natural gas resources here in the United States that do operate flexibly. But the fact that our largest competitive power market is now saying offshore wind can actually meet demand in more hours than a natural gas power plant is profound, I think. And I know the opportunity for offshore wind in Japan is also incredibly large. So I think that's just a really important area where we might be able to find some additional ways to collaborate.
ありがとうございます。洋上風力に
Thank you very much. Regarding offshore wind, it's very important for Japan, so I'd like to come back to that later. Before that, related to the discussion that we just had, in Japan, so the flexibility, from the flexibility point of view, we need the coal-fired power generation, thermal power generation, and also for decarbonization purpose, we need hydrogen as well as ammonia manufacturing using hydrogen and using ammonia as power source. When it comes to hydrogen, you mentioned that in your speech. So hydrogen usage in vehicles is not something that you expect in the future. However, hydrogen will be important for sure. That is my understanding. So in the discussions that you're having in the US, in what applications will hydrogen be used? If you could talk about that, please.
Yes, certainly. So we expect that first and foremost, clean hydrogen can replace current uses of gray hydrogen. That means things like chemicals production, feedstocks for things like sustainable aviation fuel in the future. We are really investing in building up manufacturing capacity for sustainable aviation fuel that uses clean hydrogen. We expect that it will be used in the steelmaking sector, both for primary steelmaking and for secondary or recycled steelmaking. We would expect quite a lot of use of clean hydrogen to replace, again, the gray hydrogen that goes into making ammonia-based fertilizers. We make those here in the United States. We expect that to be a great use of clean hydrogen. So, so in general, I think the conclusion that we are reaching here is that clean hydrogen has a very important role to play for synthesizing fuels that are very difficult to replace with other forms of energy. And for use in the industrial sector, where there may be chemical reactions, again, that require something like clean hydrogen. We don't see a huge role for clean hydrogen in the power sector or the transportation sector, but we do see a very important role in the industrial sector. I will just say one other thing about the industrial sector. We are learning now through a lot of the research that is on the cutting edge here about the opportunities to electrify much of the heating requirements in the industrial sector. So whereas 2 or 3 years ago even, we thought maybe clean hydrogen would play a larger role to provide industrial heat requirements, we are now discovering that there are commercially available technologies that can provide industrial heat requirements for 50 to 70% of all of our industrial heating needs that are just electric. We're not talking about combusting hydrogen for heat as much in the industrial sector even. So that's where we see the highest value applications of hydrogen.
はい、ソニアさんどうもありがとうございます。日本
Thank you very much. In Japan as well, of course, we discuss about hydrogen. So green hydrogen, how much green hydrogen can be manufactured? And what will the cost be? That is the important point. So considering that, I think that hydrogen will only be used in the areas where it is suited. So that was our thinking as well. So your comment was quite encouraging, and I am glad that we are on the same page. Thank you very much. And when it comes to Japanese policy discourse, there's one more thing that I want to ask you regarding the usage of CCS. So in your speech, you also mentioned that you said that it's possible. You mentioned about CCS, but I think that CCS usage will be limited. I believe that is your view. So regarding the utilization of CCS, can you talk about that as well?
Sure. So I think in general, the way that we think about this is many of the technologies that are modular and can be manufactured at scale repeatedly are the ones that we see coming down the learning curve the fastest. There are other clean energy options like CCS, like large-scale nuclear facilities that require a lot of site-specific engineering. And each project is itself a large, very unique challenge. So we think, similar to the applications for clean hydrogen, that CCS will play an important role for certain parts, primarily in the industry sector again, but we do not see it being able to compete on a cost basis with alternatives in the electricity sector very well. We may see a few projects, but we don't expect to see a large-scale deployment of this in the coming years. For where we do see it having an application, we're talking about industrial sector processes, usually chemical processes, not burning fossil fuels and putting the CO2 from fossil fuel burning underground. Instead, when you have a chemical reaction in the industrial sector that produces a pure stream of CO2, like when you're making ethanol or some of the other chemicals that we make, that produces this pure stream of CO2 that may be much easier to capture and store. The other area is cement making. We still do not have a lot of alternatives to make very low or zero carbon cement. And there is, again, a chemical process that is involved in making cement where we see there being substantial potential for CCS. But again, similar to clean hydrogen, we would say it's a great option. Let's see if it grows to be bigger than we expect, but it will have trouble competing on a cost basis with other clean energy options in most sectors.
ソニアさん、ありがとうございました。
Thank you, Sonia. Yes, very clear. Thank you very much. Definitely we can learn from you in Japan. So you've touched upon, especially on heavy industries. Our institute is focused on energy as well as on heavy industries. We've been working on this area from about 2 years ago. And these two sectors are interrelated because they both use energy and related to energies. And when we look at windmills and solar panels, those are the things that we need for generating clean energies. So these are, and we have to make sure that we make the supply chain for those materials clean as well. So you need a battery for an EV, you need to create, you need metals to make the body, of the car. And unless the production supply chain is clean, we cannot say EV is clean. So we need to secure a clean supply chain, and energy security is definitely important. So it's very complex. So can you share the situation and discussion taking place in the United States and also the policies that you are looking at? Thank you.
Sure. So I think there are a few avenues here. One is that taking the electric car example, there are innovation activities underway, research into new battery chemistries that are not so dependent on very rare metals or minerals like cobalt. So cobalt-free batteries is a huge area of research, and there are some very exciting developments in that space. But I agree with you that we need to pay close attention to the security, human rights aspects of ensuring that where we are sourcing these minerals and materials is meeting the standards that we all want it to meet. There are also some interesting aspects of all of this transition. One statistic is that for a net zero world, the rate of extraction for the minerals and materials needed to supply that net zero world over the next 15 years will be about 1/535th the size of the extraction needed to support the current fossil fuel-based world. So while we really need to pay attention to where these minerals and materials are coming from, how we can have the capacity to process that material and refine it, how we can do all of this in ways that really learn the lessons that we should have learned when we built a fossil fuel economy, so that we are taking account of the needs of the communities that are impacted by all of this extraction, so that we are providing economic opportunities for people who are impacted by all of this extraction. We must do that. And we also should recognize that we are talking about a scale of extraction that is multiple orders of magnitude smaller than our current scale of extraction. So that's one thing. I think investment in the processing of these minerals is going to be very important for economies like Japan and the United States, because right now the constraint for most of the minerals that are needed for clean energy is not about whether they exist in the Earth's crust or we can get them out. It's about where and how much processing capacity we have to make those materials into the form they need to be to make the stuff we want. And then finally, the last thing I would say is we are thinking quite a lot about the auto industry demand for steel. To your last point, in the United States, the auto manufacturing industry is the largest customer for primary steel. And so 2 of our 3 large car makers here have committed to produce at least 10% of their vehicles using zero carbon aligned steel by 2030. With just a little bit more volume, that could comprise a big enough pool of demand to fill an entire new zero carbon steel factory here. So I think there's just opportunities to create not just the upstream supply chain for the materials needed to produce some of the battery equipment and other stuff, but also the downstream component of how we then create this end-to-end clean product that people can benefit from having.
はい、ありがとうございます。もちろん日本においても。
Thank you. Automobile is definitely a very important industry for Japan as well. So we would like to make sure that we work together so that we can achieve net zero. Thank you. So you talked about offshore wind and also on solar and onshore wind. So in order to introduce a large-scale renewable energy production, you need land space and you need permission, approvals, and you need to form consensus with local communities. In Japan, in this area, we have some problems and we face some obstacles. So in order to accelerate the introduction of the renewables, so what are the situations in the United States to accelerate the process of the renewables so that you can form consensus more fast and get approvals faster?
Yes, this is also a big topic of conversation here in the US. I also know it's a big topic of conversation in the EU. We are not alone in worrying about where we will put these things and also trying to figure out how to get things built more efficiently. So here in the US, a big debate right now is around permitting reform at the federal government level. We have not passed additional policy beyond the Inflation Reduction Act to deal with these permitting challenges at the federal level, but it is a lively topic of conversation with our lawmakers and with the White House. So we may see some additional action on permitting reform soon. There are a couple of other things underway here in the United States. One I will mention is that we have what's called an interconnection queue. I'm not sure if that's easy to translate, but it is basically a waiting list for getting access to our transmission grid. And right now, on that waiting list, we have about 2 terawatts of clean energy projects. Now that's 2,000 gigawatts. It's even hard to imagine the scale of that. I think that would give us, I don't have the number in front of me, but it's more than half of all of the clean energy capacity we would need to meet our 2030 80% clean electricity target. Is just projects that are waiting to be approved. So this is a very big issue for us in the United States. We have some various government agencies that are working on this, but more is needed in this area. The big debate is how do we ensure that the voices of the communities that are impacted by this new infrastructure development are appropriately heard, and how do we find interesting ways to ensure that those communities benefit financially from all of this new clean energy and transmission development. So we have not solved it here, but it is definitely the subject of lots of conversation.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much. So we are not alone. And I think it's a common challenges that we face around the world. So I'm relieved to hear that. And we need soft aspects, and I think we can learn from each other between Japan and the United States. So we have a question about offshore wind. So IRA especially focuses on floating offshore wind. And can you tell us what kind of specific incentives IRA has? And any prospects of the offshore wind or floating offshore wind would be appreciated. Thank you.
Sure. So the IRA includes incentives for offshore wind that are similar to the incentives for other types of clean energy generation. That's around 30% off of the total investment. There are some additional incentives for offshore wind in the Inflation Reduction Act, which have to do with manufacturing of the components for offshore wind primarily. We also have a target for 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. That's an official target from President Biden. We also, at Energy Innovation, which is where I am now and is an independent research organization, again, not part of the government, but we have a study that will come out in about 2 weeks about additional offshore wind potential here in the United States. It has screened for siting challenges for offshore wind. It includes both floating and fixed bottom offshore wind opportunities. And we are finding that offshore wind could contribute anywhere between 10 and 25% of our total electricity needs without raising wholesale costs of energy at all, and with increasing the reliability and resilience of our electricity system. So that will be released in about 2 weeks. So you will see that. I'm happy to share it through whatever channels are useful. But we really see a huge potential for offshore wind here. And the federal government is doing a lot to try to both set targets and also to make sure that programs across the federal government are as supportive as they can be for the development of the supply chain and deployment of offshore wind.
はい、ありがとうございます。発表されるというその。
Thank you very much. So the report that will be published, I'm looking forward to reading the report. Renewable Energy Institute is also really focused on the renewable energy. So we hope that we can work together in this area as well. We are approaching the end of the discussion time. I believe we received a couple of questions. Some questions are quite detailed. So one of the important ones is about 2030 or 2035 energy supply. What will it be like? So Sonia-san talked about that, but some of the members of the audience may have different views on that. You also refer to, some people have referred to the numbers that were published by EIA. So once again, in 2030 and 2035, what will the energy supply and demand be like? What kind of energy system can we expect? What is your expectation and what will it be like? What's the image If you could once again talk about that, then your response will be the final remark during this Q&A session. You might have to repeat yourself once again, but this is an important point. So can you talk about that again?
Sure. So just to take the EIA analysis itself, I would look back at prior Energy Information Administration analyses from the United States and just look at their predictive capability for clean energy deployment. You will find in a historical retrospective that we have consistently gone faster than the Energy Information Administration predicts on clean energy deployment for the last decade or more. So they do an analysis every year. They're always undercounting where we end up, even before we had the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a transformational policy for the electricity system. So look at the history and just check against. You can see the numbers yourself. I won't have to convince you. And instead, for looking forward, I would recommend the Department of Energy is an official government analysis showing where we are expecting to go with the Inflation Reduction Act in place. They released an analysis immediately following the Inflation Reduction Act being signed into law. There is also a study which is more theoretical, but it is not an analysis of current policy, but it is from our National Renewable Energy Laboratory. And it looks at pathways to get to 100% clean electricity system by 2035, which is the official goal of the U.S. government. So I think there are a lot of both official, internal U.S. government analyses that are consistent with the messages that I was sharing. And there are also independent analyses that confirm we're looking in the 70 to 80% clean share for 2030 in the United States based on today's policies.
はい、ソニアさんどうもありがとうございます。
Sonia-san, thank you very much. So 2035, 2030 in the United States, we don't have too many years until then. So I believe that the transformation is already happening. So thank you very much for talking about the future vision once again. As Japan, the decarbonization in the energy sector is something that we need to accelerate. We are committed to the global promise. So we will have to accelerate our actions. And on that point, today we heard about the situation in the United States. And so once again, we believe that our action for decarbonization will be quite important. So I think that this opportunity was quite important for us. So once again, I'd like to thank Sonia-san as well as the U.S. Embassy for giving us the opportunity to talk about this today. So it was the time flew, but I think that we have to close the session. We had many more questions, but we need to close the session. Thank you very much, Sonia-san.
Thank you, Aikawa-san.
So I would like to hand the microphone back to Joshua-san.
Well, thank you so much, Aikawa-san. Thank you, Sonia, as well, for your sharing your excellent expertise with our audience. Incredibly important topic that's going on in the world right now. So to have you both here to be able to speak from your own personal experience from a U.S. perspective and from a Japan perspective is really something that I think our audiences will appreciate. I also want to thank our audience for participating in today's program. Apologies, we could not get to all of your questions, but I think that is an indication of how interesting and interested everyone is in this discussion. I would also like to thank our simultaneous interpreters and technicians at NHK, as well as our captioners. Lastly, I would like to invite all of you to visit our website and our social media pages and properties for further information on upcoming events and programs. And I hope to see you in the future at one of those events. All right, everyone, thanks so much for joining us today. Have a wonderful rest of your day.